Good evening. My name is Dr. Gerald Grudson. I am your moderator for this program on Islam and science. Tonight, Dr.Nuh Aydin will present the Quran and science. I also teach the history of religions at San Jose City College, both Islam and Christianity, history of philosophy, and I teach graduate courses in religion and science for Global Ministries University. I want to welcome all of you here tonight, particularly my graduate students, Penny Donovan and Thomas James, who are studying many of these issues in the courses they take. So I look forward to hearing Dr. Aydin, who teaches at Kenyon University. He's a professor of mathematics and statistics at Kenyon College in Ohio. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Aydin.
Thank you, Dr. Grudson. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And good evening and assalamu alaikum. So I would like to start with a quick summary of the first lecture from last week. We talked about premises and basic assumptions about the universe and the human mind that make scientific inquiry possible and meaningful. And we also talked about the message of Qur'an and how it relates to scientific mind and scientific activities. And we argue that Islam, not only the message of Islam, message of Qur'an is not only compatible with scientific mind, but also it provides a strong encouragement for scientific investigation and inquiries. And we saw that there is a great emphasis in the entire Quran for us to use our intellectual faculties and to study the natural world, to contemplate about it, to ponder what's going on in the universe. So many, the Quran draws our attention to so many different phenomena in the natural world. And there's a great encouragement and urge for us to investigate what's going on in the world. And given all of that, we argue that there can be no conflict between Islamic faith and science. So today, our topic is, are there any scientific facts in the Quran? If so, how and why? And is it a miracle of the Quran? So, in regards to this question, I have seen two extreme positions. So my answer is going to be yes, but it will be a qualified yes, right? So there's an important but here that we are going to talk about. So one of the extreme position is that some Muslims try to find every scientific fact, every scientific discovery in the Quran, which is misguided, because the Quran is not a book of science, and we cannot expect to find all scientific facts and discoveries in this book. On the other hand, perhaps as a reaction to this extreme position, some people say that no, we should not. There can be no scientific facts in the Quran, and we should never try to find any scientific facts in the Quran. And I would like to argue that this position is not quite accurate either. And I'm going to give a number of examples to remarkable verses in the Quran that point to some important scientific facts that are only discovered in modern times. But we are also going to see how these facts are mentioned in the Quran and the purpose of inclusion of these facts in the Quran. So is the purpose of the Quran Is it to teach us science? Well, the answer is not really. So the purpose, the reason why some scientific facts are mentioned in the Quran is given in one of the verses. So this is verse 53 of chapter 41. So it reads, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ. So which means we will show them our signs in the universe and within themselves until or so that it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. So here it refers to the pronoun it, which is who in Arabic, refers to the Quran. So once again, these are the purpose is to show the signs, to show signs to us so that we understand that the Quran contains the truth and it is coming from the Creator, who is the author of both books, the great book of the universe, and the divine revelation, the book of Quran. So the Quran is not a book of science, but it's a book of signs. So let me repeat. It is not a book of science, as in like scientific knowledge or natural sciences, but it is a book of signs. So remember last week, we talked about this concept of ayat, which is a very, very important concept in Islam, in the Quran, and it is a very comprehensive term. So it basically refers to anything that has a purpose or value or significance, anything that is worthy of contemplation, investigation, study, and spending our time for it. So this is the purpose of the fact that some scientific facts are mentioned in the Quran, oftentimes in really subtle ways, which we can only appreciate after discovering the facts. And the Quranic style is quite different from the scientific approach. You know, the scientific approach follows a certain methodology that we call the scientific method, which involves observation, hypothesis development, experimentation, and justification, the scientific method, and to reach conclusions and to establish knowledge about natural world. The Quran, on the other hand, just states the end result from the Creator without going through any of these details. So while the Quran encourages us to do scientific investigation, the actual work of science, it is for us, for humans. The Quran itself doesn't do the science for us, and it doesn't give us all of the details that you would find in a book of physics or astronomy or biology or chemistry and so forth. So scientific activity is for us, for humans, but this is not what the Quran does. So we may perhaps give an analogy here, teacher-student or a professor and student. So imagine a top researcher teaching his students, and sometimes the professor may mention some high-level facts, and sometimes students cannot even make any sense of these facts because they may not know the terminology, they may not know the concepts. So it may take the students a very long time before they can even understand what the statement means, right? So for example, if the student goes to a PhD program and acquires enough information about the subject, maybe then they may understand what the teacher meant at the time. But there may be other facts, when students may understand what the statement is, but they may not fully understand the justification or why it is the case. Maybe after they study some more, they may then figure out what's going on and exactly what the teacher meant. Aha, they may say, this is what the teacher meant, and this is why that is the case. That may happen. So they may understand the facts later after they learn more about the subject. And, the professor may once in a while may give such facts to their students, which may take them a while to fully understand and appreciate. So I think something similar is going on in the Quran, as we are going to see in the examples that we will go through about a dozen examples as a representative sample. Okay, so here is the first example. Among all the facts that pertain to scientific knowledge that we have today, I think this one, to me, is the most remarkable example. It's a very short verse from chapter 51, verse 47, which says, وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. So which means the heaven, we built it with might, and indeed we are its expander. So this verse, clearly talking about the universe being expanded. And there are so many remarkable aspects of this, this short verse, because this is one of the most important facts of modern cosmology. And this fact was only discovered in 20th century, 13 centuries after the Quran was revealed. So until the 20th century, nobody ever had any conception of an expanding universe. People imagined either an infinite universe or a fixed universe. So, the notion that the universe might be expanding was totally unheard of, and nobody could have thought about it. And there is also literary wonders in this verse. If you know the Arabic grammar, so the phrase وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ is a nominal sentence as opposed to verbal sentence, which in Arabic language, in Arabic grammar, implies that it is a continuous process. This means that the expansion of the universe is a continuous event. It is happening all the time, not just in the past or present or the future, but continuously. So there is no way that any human being could have possibly thought of anything like this in 7th century. So even all the best minds of the world came together, they would not have been able to think of something like this. So again, this is giving an end result from the Creator, and you see, so this verse has been in Quran for 13, 14 centuries, but it didn't lead Muslim scholars to invent this fact, because they just really couldn't make sense of it, right? So we only appreciate it after the fact. We only appreciate it after the fact. Some people argue that, this is a forced interpretation after the fact. There is also this kind of objection. But if you look at the Arabic, it is really clear that the phrase musi'un, this is the primary meaning of the word. It is about expansion, and it's clearly talking about the expansion of the universe. So since people and scholars really could not comprehend this meaning, they came up with other meanings were not the primary meanings of this word. So it turns out that the other interpretations were the forced interpretations, and so now after the fact we can appreciate the primary meaning of the word and what it really means now after the fact. So just imagine those students, reaching a much more advanced level of knowledge many years later, appreciating what the professor said many years before, right? So something similar is going on here. And again, the purpose of this verse is not really to teach us science, which really didn't happen, right? So this verse did not teach Muslim scholars the science. Rather, it is a sign for us that this book contains the truth in it, right? So the verses, there is a remarkable harmony between the verses of the Quran and the signs in the natural world. This is only possible because the author of the both books are one and the same. So that is the meaning of this verse. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. So afaq means the horizons or the universe, and this is a perfect example of such a verse that explains what is meant by this verse. That is the purpose of Quran's mention of facts like this. Okay, so our next example, verse 30 from chapter 21. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا وَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. So this verse is telling us that the heavens and the earth were a joint entity. It was a single entity, and they were separated. And every living thing is made out of water, right? So you see, this is again pointing to the origin of the universe as well as the origin of life, right? The origin of life is water, and the earth and the heavens were joined together. It was a single entity, and they were separated later. Once again, this is in remarkable agreement with modern science, particularly the Big Bang theory. Of course, expansion of the universe is also the what Big Bang theory, Big Bang is telling us. So this theory was proposed in 1920s, and the final conclusive evidence was obtained in 1960s by the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation, which led to Nobel Prize in physics for the discoverers. So initially it was a theoretical proposition, but then it was supported by actual evidence. And now it is the accepted theory about the origin of the universe, which of course tells us that the entire universe was a single small point, very hot and dense, and it began to expand and cool down, and this process has been going on since the beginning of the time. So, and again, nobody had any notion, any theory like this in 7th century, and nobody had this notion until the 20th century. So how is it that the Quran is talking about this? Who was the audience? The audience at the time, 7th century Arabia, or for that matter, the rest of the world, they really couldn't make sense of these words, these verses, previous one and this one. now in 21st century, we have a much better appreciation and understanding of this word, these verses. So our next example is about the relativity of the time. So we see a number of verses in the Quran that suggest that time is not a fixed, time is not absolute, it does not have a fixed scale. So there are verses that say that one day can mean 1,000 years of our ordinary days, or it can be 50,000 years sometimes. Another verse suggests that a lifetime could mean, in another scale, a day or less than a day. So it is a relative, time is a relative concept. So once again, the relativity of the time is one of the revolutions of physics in 20th century. So before that, before Einstein's theory of general relativity, nobody had the notion that the time could be relative. So, so we now know that the rate at which time passes depends on your speed and your acceleration. If you are traveling at or near the speed of light, the passage of time will be much different than what we experience time in the ordinary life. So it is really remarkable, and now we can appreciate it now that the Quran suggests that the time is relative. And again, nobody could have known this, could come up with this idea in 7th century. It is not humanly possible for anyone to think about this. But once again, this is not really like a scientific knowledge that Muslims, that led the Muslim scholars to discover this. We only appreciate it after the fact. Therefore, it serves as a sign as opposed to scientific knowledge. Now, if you go back to the expansion of the universe, it follows from Einstein's theory of relativity. When other scholars realized that his theory would imply an expanding universe, Einstein himself couldn't believe it because of his strong belief in the accepted paradigm of stationary universe. The Newtonian word, stationary universe. So he just couldn't believe his own the implications of his own theories and his equations. So to make his theory fit his preconception of the universe, he invented something called cosmological constant, which he inserted into his own equations so that they would predict a stationary universe as opposed to an expanding universe. When it was empirically proven that the universe is actually expanding, he then abandoned this artificial, insertion that's called cosmological constant, and he called it the biggest blunder of his life. So, even greatest scientists like Einstein can be wrong about scientific facts. And if you look at the history of science, we see that similar things happened in the past as well. So, for example, Ptolemy, who was the expert, the Greek expert on astronomy, when his astronomical models, when there was discrepancy between his astronomical models on paper and actual observations, what he did was to make his models to predict the actual events, astronomical events. What he did was he tweaked his models by introducing, bizarre, strange things like epicycles and difference, and he made his models really complicated and really farther from the physical reality that he ended up with, like absurd models that took a lot of scholars very long time to fix or to eliminate or to deal with. So, so this expansion of the universe is really a novel idea that even Einstein himself couldn't believe, even though it was a consequence of his own theory. Now imagine the fact that this is mentioned in the Quran in 7th century. I mean, this is simply amazing. Okay, our next example is about the end of the universe. So the Big Bang theory predicts two possible ultimate fates for the universe. There are, one possibility is a big crunch, the other is a big freeze. So the first possibility would occur if the mass density of the universe at the beginning was greater than a critical density, a critical value. If that is the case, then the universe will expand a maximum and will stop expanding. And in fact, the process will reverse and it will begin to collapse, and the entire process will reverse, and everything will collapse together into a single point, so which is very hot and dense. So everything will so this is called a big crunch. The other scenario is if the initial density was below the critical density, then expansion will slow down, but will never stop, and the formation of stars will stop, and stars will run out of fuel, and so it will. So when new stars will not form, existing stars will die, burn out, and it will leave white dwarfs, neutron stars, and black holes, and collisions between them will result in black holes, larger and larger black holes, and the average temperature of the universe will gradually and asymptotically decrease, and it will eventually approach absolute zero. So this is called the big freeze. So the universe will end in a big freeze. Now, so in the Quran, there are many verses that describe the end of the time. So here is one of the, there are really many, many verses in the Quran that describe what will happen at the end of the time. And they all seem to point to the first scenario, which is big crunch. So here is one remarkable verse that is talking about that, right? We will fall to heaven like the folding of a sheet, and as we began the first creation, we will repeat it. So, this implies that everything will come back to the beginning, initial state of a single point, everything collapsing to the single point. And Allah says, this is a promise, it will certainly happen, right? Because He is the creator, He is talking out of authority. Okay, our next example, subatomic particles. So there are several verses in the Quran that talk about, the deeds of atoms' weight. So one of the verse, some of the verses say, whoever does an atom's weight of goodwill will say it, and whoever does an atom's weight of evil will also say it. But another verse talks about deeds of atom's weight or smaller than that. So there is the notion of something being smaller than atoms. That is also really a novel idea, right? So it was only at the end of the 19th century that we know about subatomic particles like electrons, photons, protons, neutrons, and so forth. There are a bunch of these, and not all of them are well understood or even not fully discovered. But there was simply no notion of anything being smaller than atom until the 19th century. But there is this verse talking about it. Again, the way this verse talks about it is not the way a book of physics would talk about it. And this kind of verse in the Quran didn't lead Islamic scholars, Muslim scholars, to discover these particles. Once again, we only appreciate this after the fact. But this doesn't make it an artificial or forced interpretation of the word, of the verse. It is clearly there. It is clear Arabic. It is talking about things being smaller than an atom. So, and why would anyone talk like, existence of things smaller than an atom? This whole notion of something being smaller than atom in the 7th century is simply beyond any person's capacity. Prophet Muhammad, as we know, was unlettered. But even if you brought the best minds of the time together, they wouldn't think of this notion. So another remarkable example in the Quran is development of embryo in a mother's womb. So here is one verse talking about, he creates you in the wombs of your mothers, creation after creation, within 3 veils of darkness. So this phrase, 3 veils of darkness, it turns out that it is really a subtle reference. The number 3 is not an arbitrary number here, as we'll see. And then another few verses give a more detailed, so this is like a bit more detailed description of what's going on in the development of an embryo. It is talking about, something that clings, a clinging clot that suspends or hangs. All of these things. So we now know that there are 3 primary germ layers in embryo, which are called ectoderm, which is the outer layer, mesoderm, the middle one, and endoderm. So, of course, we didn't know about these things until modern times. And a Western authority, Dr. Keith Moore, who was a leading authority on embryology, he did study the verses of the Quran on this matter, and he wrote about this. So here is, and he was really impressed and amazed by the accuracy of the verses, descriptions in the Quran, especially given the fact that it was, stated in 7th century. So here is a quote from Dr. Moore. So he says, after studying these verses in the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad on this matter, he says, I was astonished by the accuracy of the statements that were recorded in the 7th century AD before the science of embryology was established. So it is totally astonishing that such details and in such accuracy would be contained in a book that was written in 7th century. Okay, so our next example is about the movement of the sun. So this verse 38, chapter 36 says, the sun runs or flows his course towards a point of stability. So it doesn't say that it rotates, it says runs. You see, so there is, again, there is subtlety in the choice of words in the Quran. So this is the same word that you would use for the flow of rivers, for example. So it is using the same word for the sun. So we now know that everything in the universe moves, right? The earth rotates around the sun, but the sun is not static either. The sun and entire solar system moves around the Milky Way galaxy. And in fact, that takes about 230 million years for one revolution. It is called a galactic year, right? 230 million years. So the sun is part of an arm of the Milky Way galaxy that is called Orion arm, and it is turning around Milky Way. And Milky Way itself is also moving at a great speed of 2.1 million kilometers per hour with respect to extragalactic frames of reference. So everything in the universe is moving. You know, the movement can be a circular motion or more complicated motion, and there are in fact several movements for the same, you know, the Earth rotating around its own axis around the sun, and then the sun and the solar system is turning around the Milky Way, and Milky Way as a whole is also moving. So the movement is really more complicated. So therefore, the Quran is not using the word just rotate, it just says runs or flows. So there is subtlety of extreme sophistication in the choice of words like that. And again, I mean, people, so until Copernicus, the accepted paradigm of the universe was the Earth is the center, and everything is rotating around the Earth, including the sun. So Copernicus changed the center from Earth to the sun, but of course we know that neither model was really accurate, far from being accurate, and Quran's description is not, you know, pinning us down to any one of these models. It is being more general, and it is in agreement with what we know about the universe now. Okay, so another example. So a couple of verses here. One verse is talking about the sky being a protected ceiling, and the sky that which returns things. So, you know, sometimes we need to refer to other verses of the Quran to understand the meaning of a given verse. So in this case, the second verse would help us explain what protected ceiling means. So this ceiling is itself protected, but it's also protecting us from some things. Of course, we now know that the atmosphere protects us from many harmful things, right? For example, harmful rays of the sun, and it burns and destroys meteors that are headed towards Earth, and it also keeps our planet from having extreme temperatures, extreme temperature changes. Without this protective blanket, we would have very hot days and freezing nights. So it would be not very suitable for life. So at the same time, the atmosphere is letting the beneficial stuff to come in, but it is keeping away the harmful rays or other objects. So now we can understand it better what these words mean by protected ceiling or protecting ceiling. So this Arabic word mahfuzan it can be understood as both the atmosphere itself is protected, but also protecting the earth, and the sky that which returns, it is returning a lot of things back, a lot of harmful things back to the sky, the outer sky. So these very short verses contain remarkable meanings that we only understand by modern science. Once again, these are signs rather than scientific knowledge that Muslim scholars could extract from the Quran. Okay, another example, mountains as stakes. So this verse says, the mountains are created as stakes, and another verse indicates that the mountains within earth, he placed firmly set mountains. So they play a role in stabilizing the earth. And we know now that mountains have roots, just like the stakes would, right? So you wouldn't have a stake that wouldn't have a root. So we now know that the roots of mountains are 5 to 10 times deeper, even sometimes more. So, for example, Mount Everest, the highest peak in the world, itself is about 9 kilometers tall, but its roots is about 125 kilometers. So we can now understand the meaning of stakes better now, which people wouldn't know until recent times. Okay, our next example about the honeybee. So what about honeybee? So there is a verse. In fact, there is a whole. By the way, a lot of verses in the Quran are named after natural elements. Like this verse is, there's a verse called Nahl, which means bee. There is not verse, chapter. The chapter called the bee. Some chapters are called, Ankebut, the spider. There are many other examples like that. So in this verse, so God is saying, your Lord inspired the female bee about its habitation and how it should go around, finding the food and making the honey. And at the end of the day, once again, oftentimes these verses often sign, once again, means something that is worthy of investigation. So in this case, the scientific fact here is really subtle, and it also includes a literary element here. So we understand that the God is inspiring to female bee by the conjugation of this command ittakhidhi. You see, so Arabic has genders. So this command indicates it is a command for a female. So we can infer from here that it is the female honey that is making. It's the female bee that is making the honey. So it is really a subtle point, but when we think about it, we see that it is actually a remarkable point. Yet another sign. So we now know that it is female worker bees that produce the honey. This was definitely not known in 7th century. Okay, I think this is my last example. So this verse is saying, corruption has appeared on the land and the sea due to what people have done by their hands, due to the actions of people. so that he may let us taste part of the consequence of what we have done, so that perhaps that we may change our course, our behavior. So now in 21st century, we can really appreciate what this verse is talking about, right? So the verse is saying that corruption appeared in the sea and the land. In other words, it is a global problem. It's a global environmental crisis, and it is also indicating that it is because of the actions of human beings. And it is also telling us that we better get our acts together and change our behavior, because we are already seeing some of the consequences of what could happen if we don't change our behavior. So we clearly know that if things won't change, the harmful consequences of climate change and other environmental crises, it will get much worse. So again, this kind of understanding of environment and humans' role in the corruption of environment, it is really a modern phenomenon, right? I mean, nobody in 7th century could think about these things in these terms. So, so this is my selection of verses like that. There are certainly more examples in the Quran, but you see, based on these examples, so we can see that we really need to be careful about and pay attention to the purpose and the style of the Quran in mentioning scientific facts. So they are not mentioned for the sake of teaching us scientific knowledge. Rather, they are mentioned as ayat. This concept of ayat, signs, that for us to ponder. Anything that is a sign means it is significant, it is important, it is valuable, and it is worthy of our study and investigation and spending our time on it, because it is from the Creator, and we can understand His creation better by engaging in scientific activities. So there is so profound encouragement, I would say, as a scientist, for us to undertake scientific activities. With this point of view, scientific activities become a form of worship and becomes really valuable. And it is, I also want to make the point once again that it is totally remarkable that we have such statements in the Quran that we can only understand in 21st century, and probably there are more statements like that we will understand in the future yet, as we learn more about the natural world. So this is the end of my presentation, and thank you for listening. I can take questions if there are any.
One question I had relates to the relationship of the Quran, which sometimes is called the eternal Quran, meaning that the real Quran is with God in heaven, because it's meant that if it comes from God, it must be something eternal. So in that sense, the question is the physical Quran, meaning which was created, I believe, over a 20-year period,
right,
during the time of as you said, the Prophet was unlettered. So these were oral teachings that he received.
Right.
People gradually wrote them down over a period, I guess, of about 20 years. And then that became the final Quran that we use today. Actually was finally the canonical, we call it the canonical Quran, was a process that took about 20 years. And so the question is, just as we have with the Bible, we talk about the Bible as the Word of God. The Quran is the Word of God. So is the Quran a copy of something that is in the heavens, you might say, with God? So if it's a copy, then are the scientific facts that you've brought out also eternal? Because if the whole Quran is the Word of God, would not the scientific signs, the ayat you're talking about, would this not also be part of the eternal part of the Quran? That's a question I have. Philosophical question, maybe, but so if you're going to argue for the signs, would not the signs also have to be part of the eternal nature of the Quran?
Yeah, so I would say, so there is the physical Quran, so it is like, when you write a book, you have the knowledge of the book in your mind, and the book, the physical book, is a representation of that.
Right.
But the meanings, though, they are eternal, right? So the meanings that are contained in the Quran, they are eternal. And so I would say these scientific facts are part of the knowledge of the infinite, all-knowing God, right? It is a reflection of the infinite knowledge of all-knowing God. So I would say, yes, it is a reflection of His infinite knowledge and wisdom.
A secondary question, I believe the word is ijtihad, which means that among some Muslim theologians, they say that you can interpret just like we have the Bible, often there's an interpretation of the meaning of a verse, like you've been talking about your interpretation of various surahs. Same thing in the Bible. So there's the scholars who are interpreters, and some in the Muslim world said that meaning can, in a sense, I don't know if the right word is change, but depending on the era of, let's say, from the time of the 7th century to today, can the understanding change?
Right.
And that word is ijtihad, I think, which means that there can be a new understanding of that verse. Just like the Bible, biblical scholars say the meaning could be understood in a different way in a different time. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And so it is also not the case that a verse or a word is a single meaning. So this is one of the remarkable features of the Quran. In fact, Quran is also a miracle in the sense of literature, in the literary sense, right? So it challenged. So the Arabs at the time, the Arabs did not have any high, sciences or other things. They were masters of literature and poetry, and the Quran challenged them. He said it was, Quran challenged them on what they were proud of. So the thing is, a word can have multiple meanings, and they're not necessarily contradictory to each other. They can be complementary, right? And we also believe that Quran is universal, meaning it addresses people of 7th century as well as people of 21st century, and people's understanding of the Quran can change, definitely, and it is one of the features of the Quran rather than a shortcoming. And by the way, the word ijtihad really means like consensus, right? Consensus. So so sometimes scholars, most of the scholars can agree on, and this word ijtihad is not specific to the interpretation of the verses of the Quran. It applies to many other matters in religion, like jurisprudence and the laws and other things. So sometimes there is consensus on religious matters in Islam, whether it pertains to Quran or Hadith or other matters. But the thing is, even if there is a consensus on something, as we have seen, as the scientific knowledge changes, it doesn't mean that it is absolutely right. And we see the same thing in the history of science as well. You see, there was a universal consensus on the astronomical model, the geocentric astronomical model, for example, right? So all the scientists, or at least most of them, agreed that the Earth is the center of the universe, correct? The best minds of humankind agree on it. There was a consensus about it, but the consensus does not mean by itself that it is the absolute truth, right? So the same applies to anything. So the ijtihad really means consensus, and consensus may turn out to be false even, right? So it happens in all matters in, whether it is science.
We know that in Islam and Christianity, there have been periods where certain scholars were more literal in their interpretation of certain verses. And that has led to, we talk about the problems of fundamentalism in religion.
Right.
Would you want to comment on that? Because some scholars claim that in the Middle Ages, after the period of the Mongolian invasion, there was a tendency for Sunni Islam to be captured in some way by a more fundamentalist group. Would you want to? Yeah, that's a general interpretation. I don't know if that's accurate, but I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, similar things happened in Islam as well.
Yeah.
The Quran itself says, that some of the verses are essential, muhkemat, clear, and some of the verses are allegorical, So Quran itself says that. So there is definitely analogies and allegorical verses in the Quran, and it is true that some people can go to extreme in either direction, right? So some people interpret everything to the letter, to the extreme literal interpretation, but on the other hand, there is always this extremism is a two-way street, like in all matters. But on the other hand, there are people who go to the other extreme and they say everything is allegorical, right?
Right.
The Quran itself says, there is two categories, but it also says that most of the verses are clear, muhkemat, well established, clear, not allegorical, and that has always been like in any human society.
Sure.
Muslims are not really different. You will find people going to extreme in either direction, even to this date, right? Even to this date, there are people who are so strictly literal about the verses of the Quran. So, for example, the Aydin, for example, which means we created the heavens with our hands. So some people, want to think it is like actual physical hands, but it is, it is more reasonable to assume that it means the power of God rather than physical hands. So I think similar thing happened, everywhere, anytime, in every society, and similar problems. Yeah, you're right. I mean, extreme literalism. In fact, it is behind, groups like ISIS. They are, a bad, really a horrible example of extreme literary interpretation of the Quran and some of the Hadiths, unfortunately. Yeah.
I think we're coming to the end of our period, and I want to thank you for such a clear and stimulating presentation.
Okay, so far it was more like philosophical discussion. I guess next time will also be philosophical, and also historical now. So there will be more history as well. So we'll talk about this famous golden age of science in Islam, what kind of golden age it was. And, we'll talk about such matters as what was Islam's reaction to foreign sciences, and was it Al-Ghazali who was responsible to bring an end to the golden age? And there was a famous debate between Imam Al-Ghazali and Muslim philosophers. We'll talk about the nature of that debate and whether modern science revealed anything about the matters that they were discussing. And we'll also talk about some misconceptions about Islamic contributions to sciences, both in the West and the Muslim world as well. So that will be our next topic next week. So I hope you can join us.
Thank you, everybody who did come to the session, and we look forward to your presentation next week. And thank you for our sponsor, the Salam is the Islamic Science Program, sponsored by this Salam organization. Thank you very much for everyone who participated. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Okay, thank you and good night.